Welcome to this talk. Welcome to from zero to hero with Spring Boot 2.0. So if you're not familiar with Spring Boot, that's the perfect talk. But just so you know, if you have some experience with Spring Boot, it's also not a bad place because I'm going to show you the getting started experience that you can expect with Spring Boot 2.0. So compared to 1.5 in previous, we changed a few things. So you'll see that during the talk. And this will be a whole demo-oriented presentation. Just before we start, I just wanted to know who's using Spring Boot already nowadays? OK. And who's not using or not familiar with Spring Boot? OK, good enough. So that's a good mix. Perfect. So also, just so you know, everything here is based on the current state of affairs, so 2.0 milestone 7. We're still in the milestone phase, but it should be the last one. So if you have not tested yet the latest milestone, you should definitely do this. And especially if you see something today that you think is strange or you don't really agree with, just try things out with your existing applications and send us an issue or a note, and we'll be happy to take a look at that. Now, if you're wondering, the whole presentation and the whole code powering that application is located there. So it's already available there, commit by commit, explanations and all. So you can just sit and relax, and we can do that application together. All right. So just like this morning, if you want to start a Spring Boot application, the best thing is to go to start.spring.io, fill in a few things, a few details, and in our case, for example, saying I want to build a web app, select here the latest milestone, hit Generate Project. You can change a few other things as well, but hit Generate, and you'll get a zip of that application that is ready to be used. So it's not only the configuration, it comes also with a few opinions, and we'll see that right now. So if you unzip that, what you get is a skeleton application. And in that skeleton, what you have is here a POM. So what we can see is we have a parent, so the Spring Boot starter parent POM, which brings essentially the dependency management. So that's why in a Spring Boot application POM, you don't usually declare a lot of dependencies, is because a lot of those are managed already by the parent. So this is pretty useful for applications because you know that the versions of your libraries that you're using, they're kind of blessed by the Spring Boot team, or we're running our tests with those integration tests. And we're pretty careful to not break public APIs through those libraries, so you can stay on those quite safely. Not compulsory, but you can use it as well. The build plugin, so that brings you typically the jar packaging and other things as well. So you could do things manually, but it's pretty useful to have that also. So here we've got a starter application with a web and tests. And the goal of our application here is to have an issues dashboard for us. So let's say you have several projects on GitHub, and you'd like to see whatever happens on those projects, all the events, an issue opened, a comment, something. And you'd like to have that on a particular page. And you will use that sample use case to build an application and showcase a few features and a few things you can do with Spring Boot. So the first thing we'd like to do is start the application. And to understand the essence of Spring Boot is that most of the times when you start to express an opinion, Spring Boot is trying to express one as well. So here we've said this is a web application, saying that we'll bring several dependencies, including Spring MVC and Tomcat as a default server. So as we can see here, starting the application, we'll start a Tomcat server on port 8080. And if you go to that place, you'll see a white label error page. So we've got nothing now. We just have a 404. So we've got this, but just so you know as well, if you do that the same way with a command line or curl or something, instead of having an HTML page, you get a nice error in JSON format. So already first opinions, nice error handling and useful messages in your application. Now, what we'd like to do is to have projects. So we'd like to have an organization name, GitHub organization name, and repo name, and those are the projects we'd like to look at. So to do that, we'd like to persist those in a database because we'd like to choose those and have that in our application. So if you want to do that, you can express, that's one of the ways of adding features to your Spring Boot application. You can start to ask for a starter, and here we'd like a Spring Boot starter data JPA. So with that, you get Spring Data JPA and Hibernate and other things as well. So this is not enough because what you'd like to have as well is to store those things for now into a data store. Here, for our use case, we'll use H2 as an in-memory database. Let me make myself offline for now. And once we have that, we can restart our application. So we've got our application started, and here we can see that we've got some Hibernate stuff happening, and we'd like to see things actually, but there's nothing really here to see. We don't have entities, we don't have anything yet. So one thing we could actually have is to use DevTools. With Spring Boot DevTools, it's helping you to have a better experience while you're developing with Spring Boot. Yeah, question? Sorry? Can you go into presentation mode? Oh, sorry, yeah. Please remind me of this if I forgot to turn that on. You can use DevTools, and DevTools is super useful for all your development lifecycle. So we'll see what it can bring. But DevTools will bring several things, including here. If you start an application with an H2 server embedded, it probably means that you're in development mode. Here we are in development mode, and what Spring Boot is doing is that it's starting the H2 console as well as a servlet in your application. So this is super useful. You can see your database when you've got things already set up. So here we've got nothing yet, obviously. So we can start to add things. Here I'd like to add here under an events package, because we'll look at the events going on in our repositories, GitHub repositories. So here what we can add is a GitHub project entity. I've got that ready. GitHub project. So this is a simple entity with a generated value as an ID and the organization name and the repo name in GitHub. So we'd like to have that persisted in a database. With Spring Data JPA, we definitely need a repository. So we'll add a GitHub project repository as an interface. What we need is to have a repository to tell what we'd like to have. So we're persisting GitHub projects and with long as IDs. And if you've not seen that on the GitHub project, we have a unique constraint on the repo name, because we are under the assumption that we'll look at only one name project with a particular name, and we'll not look at several projects with the same name under several organizations. So to simplify things, we'd like to have this unique constraint. So because we have that, we can add a specific method in our interface. So if you don't know about Spring Data, here, just by the sheer virtue of adding a new method in an interface, if you follow some rules and some constraints, you can define methods, and they'll be automatically implemented for you. So here we'd like to have a find by repo name, and with the repo name. And we know that we'll get a GitHub project because we know it's unique, and we'll get only one. So just with that, and here, the thing we could do is, okay, if I just recompile, my application will get restarted. Not the whole JVM, just the Spring context. So that's one thing I'd like to discuss with you first. So DevTools is doing something nice. So whenever you have DevTools on class path and you're running your application in your IDE, so not java-jar because that's supposed to be production-like. So if you're running your application like this, DevTools will detect that and will start your application with different class loaders, one class loader for your libraries and stuff, and one class loader for your application code. And whenever something changes in your application class path, here your code, right? The Spring context will be restarted if you added a class or changed something to a class. And restarting that is super quick. And you can see changes live on your application. You don't need to restart your server all the time. And if you're changing only static resources or things like this, you don't need the process won't even restart at all. It'll be reflected live. So here we can see that we are back into the H2 console. And we see that we've got our GitHub project table with ID or name repo name. And that table was generated by JPA. But here, what we'd like to do as well is to manage the schema of our database ourselves. We don't want that to be generated by the ORM because we'd like to have, for example, migrations, and we like to run migrations in production. So changing your schema, adding columns, and things like this. So for that, we can use a library that's called Flyway, and Spring Boot as an integration for that. So here, we can add a dependency, which is Flyway core. So adding that dependency will add a few things to the mix. And we see that if we restart our application right away, and I'll explain you why I'm restarting. So here we get an error message saying that we're waiting for something in our class path in database migration. That's because with Flyway, you're expected to provide migration scripts to take care of your database schema. And I've restarted because DevTools, because I told you that DevTools is separating things into class loaders. Whenever you do something to your Gradle build or Maven POM, you should restart your application because DevTools won't look at the library change. It won't see it. So whenever you change something to your build, make sure just to restart, and all the other changes should be taken care of automatically. So here we'd like to take care of this, and we'd like to add a migration script. So with that migration script, the usual way to name those is to have a version name, and then __, and then a name for your migration. And here we'll call it init and SQL. And here we'll just like to describe what our schema will look like. So here we're just describing a schema, database schema for our GitHub project, putting an index and all. So if I restart it, then we can take another look at our database. And this time, we still get the GitHub project thing, but we get an additional table. And the schema version is a table that's managed by Flyway. And that's where you basically see all the migrations that happened in your application. Here we run the version 1 script, and that's the checksum, and it was installed on, et cetera, et cetera. Same thing, we'd like to add a new one to add some data for the demo. So obviously, this is all an in-memory database, but I could do that with a local MySQL install, and that's actually the use case for that kind of stuff, is to run against an existing database with existing data. So here, we can add another script to insert some data. And this time, I'll insert some things. So a few projects. So Spring Boot, Initializer, and Sagan. A few projects like this. So again, if I recompile, my application is restarting. And if I look at the schema this time, we see 2 migrations. And if I look at the GitHub project, I see all those projects persisted already in our database. So cool, we've got our starting point. We've got a few data with some data in our database with a few GitHub projects. And now we got to deal with the hard part, which is fetching data from the GitHub API for those projects. So for that, we need to add a few things. I'll first add a GitHub package. And we will track a few things from the GitHub API. So I need first to write a few classes to deserialize data from the JSON, REST JSON API GitHub is providing. So we'll track repository events. So those events here. So this is a simple class that's tailored for Jackson. So here we've got for each event, we got a type of event, the creation when it was created, and additional data like the actor who did that action, and if there's an issue related to that event, which issue it is. So we don't want to spend too much time here, but we know that we need an actor, and then that actor got ready, so we'll have a logging, avatar, etc. And if we go back here, we've got as well issue and issue here. Okay, good enough. So we have all of this, and we're ready to deserialize data from the GitHub API. So now we need to create a GitHub client, something to fetch data from the GitHub API. And we'd like to fetch those events and at first expose those as a REST endpoint to see if we're on the right track. So let's do this. So we can create now. Okay, I knew it. Okay. So we can create a GitHub client, which is a component. And we'll see how Spring Boot can help us as well writing that type of that kind of code. So we want to fetch data from an existing GitHub API. So we'll use this URL, which is the events, issues events in the GitHub API. And we like to use that one to fetch our events. So I know I'll need a REST template. Here, but it's not something that I want to create as a bean. I'll use the REST template builder. So a REST template builder is something that Boot is providing as well. So let's say you want to have all the nice configuration things that Spring Boot provides. So including, for example, with REST template, Spring Boot is providing the type of client that powers the REST template. So if it is the JDK one or Apache HTTP or OKHTTP or anything else. So depending on what you have on class path, we'll configure things differently because you expressed an opinion. We'll try to go ahead with it So the type of client and as well the deserialization options. So if you write something in your application properties about Jackson properties or Jackson configuration, we'll reflect that in the deserialization process that will take place with the REST template. So the builder is quite useful because let's say you don't want necessarily to expose that REST template as a bean in your application. You probably want to still have that opinion in boot. So the builder is definitely this. It's just a builder API that you can use to just build if you're happy with it, or you can do more things in it and customize that builder, and we'll do that later. So here we'd like to have the response, the response from the API from GitHub. So let's say we want a response entity with the repository events as an array, and we'll call that fetch events with a string, org name, and a repo name. So to fetch that, it's quite easy. We can use our REST template and ask for an entity about that URL, the event issues one. We know that we want an array of repository events, and we want to replace the parts with owner and repo. We want to replace that with the arguments of that method. So if we do that, we have directly that response entity, and we're already ready to have that. So we can definitely expose that as a controller. And let's say we want to create an events controller as a REST, as a controller, like that. And here, because we haven't seen much of the power of DevTools, I'll show you something else as well. So here, if we go to the root page of our application, we've got a 404. But here, I'll just show you this. Here, I've got a little extension in my browser, which is live reload. So if you install that, it's not specific to Spring Boot. It's a standard protocol you can have with many applications. So it's just a WebSocket server running into the Spring Boot applications when DevTools is enabled. And that's a way to tell any client here, our browsers, that something changed on the web page. So whenever you change something in your application, something is triggered, the server is sending an event to the browser, and the page refreshes automatically. So it's not really fancy, but it's super useful whenever you're writing your application. You don't have to refresh things all the time. So here we're connected because the dot is black. And I can start to have I can create a new endpoint for the mapping. So let's say here, I want to create a response body, and I'll call it, let's say, events with a repo name, something like this. And I'll stream repository events, fetch events with a repo name that I'll fetch from the actual URL. So this is a path variable. Okay, to show you something first, we need to fetch that data from using GitHub, the GitHub client, and the actual repository that we've got with all the projects. So because we just have a repo name, we'd like to get the org name and the repo name. So for that, we need to get the GitHub project repository injected in our application. And we also need to get our GitHub client as well, also final. So let's add that as constructor parameters. And we're ready to have something here. So let's say I'm looking in my repository, and I'm looking at the repo name, and I want to know if there's a project named like this. So let's say if my we'll say that our project is not null, but we could do like we could send a 404 or something like this. But here we just like to return our GitHub client and fetch the events for the project that we found with its org name and the project with the repo name. And we'll get the body of this directly. So refreshing this and going to the events here, we should get the information from GitHub. So I've got an extension going on with my browser, so that's why it's displayed properly. So here we can see what happened on the Spring Boot project recently. So some issue got unlabeled, and we're seeing things here deserialized. So we've got the basics running for our application, and we're fetching data from GitHub. Right. One thing that is not really displayed here is that whenever you're using the GitHub API, the GitHub API is rate limited. So basically, from a given IP, you're allowed to make roughly 60 calls per hour, which is not a lot. So that application, if run in production, that won't really work after a few queries. So we definitely want to have some authentication token in our application to send that authentication token to the GitHub API so we can have a better rate limit, something more comfortable so that our application doesn't explode at runtime. So we'd like to have a configuration key and have that into our GitHub client to send that token with all the requests. But this can be a bit tedious. If you try to do that yourself, you'd have to manage the environment and then create configuration yourself, etc. So here, Spring Boot is providing a nice infrastructure, a nice mechanism, which is the configuration properties. And you already see that when you use the application properties and you go like server.port, something like this, you already have auto-completion within your IDE, favorite IDE. And you can get the information about what it does, and this is automatically configured in the right place. So you can use that already to express opinions in Spring Boot applications. But if you would like to do that yourself as well for your own application, you can definitely do that. So here, what I'd like to have is a GitHub properties class. So defining your own properties is not hard at all. It's just a simple POJO to start with. So here we'd like to have a token. So token. And that will be our main property that we'll have with our GitHub properties. So we're almost there, starting with this. So we'd like to have a GitHub.token configuration key. So for this, we need to express to tell Spring Boot that we need to be in the GitHub namespace in our application. So to do that, you can add a configuration properties annotation and say, I want to be under the GitHub namespace in my application. And as soon as you do that, you see that in your ID, you have a red banner saying that you should definitely do something, and we'll do that a bit later. So once you have that, you can also you need to tell Spring Boot that that configuration class exists. So how Spring Boot works with our own configuration in Spring Boot, we're not enabling all the configurations for everything. We're enabling those whenever it's useful in your application. So whenever the associated configuration will run. So in this case, we're not running Webflux. So we won't parse and enable all the Webflux-related configuration. And that's the same thing for our application. So we need to tell Spring Boot that you need to look at that configuration class. So usually you want to do that either in your own auto-configuration, if you're writing your own. And if you'd like to know more about this, you can come to a talk tomorrow given by Stefan and I about the under the cover of Spring Boot, how Spring Boot is working internally and how things work. So you can see it's not magic at all. But here we can just say that we want to enable the configuration properties for our GitHub properties, GitHub properties class. So just doing this, we have now our application that will take care of, Spring Boot will take care of that key, and we can reuse it somewhere. But as you can see, if I go to the application properties and if I write GitHub, nothing happens. And that's where the reddish banner here is really useful. If you click on it, it will bring you to the reference documentation of Spring Boot. And this will tell you that if you want to have the nice auto-completion support in your IDE, you can have that really easily. It's just about adding a dependency to your project. So that'll be the annotation, the configuration processor. So this is an annotation processor. So it will, at compile time, it will look at your project, and it will look at all the classes in your project, and it will generate metadata based on the configuration classes that you wrote. So if I compile here, what happens is not only I get something new in my target classes meta-inf here. So you can see it created the metadata associated with whatever we wrote. So here, it's in GitHub properties, we've got a token property, but it's not enough. So let's say we want to document that, and we want to say this is the GitHub API token, and it should look like user and sample token, something like this. So if we recompile, we can see that the description has been added already to the metadata, and IDEs know about this. So if you go in application properties and you start writing a GitHub again, we can see all the nice information already displayed in our IDE about this. So we could configure the token right there. One thing that bothers me is that, like, in the documentation of that property, I said it should look like user colon something. But if I do something like this will work. And nothing will complain about this. The application will restart, and I'll just have a problem at runtime whenever I try to send a request. It won't be taken into account. So I'd like to add something more to make sure that it's working properly, that that format is respected. So for this, I'd like to add some data here. So we can tell it that it's a pattern, and we can add validation. So it's a regexp, and we'll have a word, and then colon, and then another word. And if we tell it that it's validated, that way Spring Boot knows that you want that property class to be validated in all the values, and that it should expect the validation rules to be right. So if I rerun, this time I get a nice application error saying that it failed to start because the value test that I provided is definitely not the right one, and that should have that matching regexp working with my properties. So this is a bit better, right? So we should definitely now use that property and stop having this. So if you want to use it, you can inject it anywhere in your as a component in your application. So we definitely want to inject here. So now we've got we want the properties here, and we want to get that token information ready in our project. So we'd like to add an interceptor so that every time we send a request to the GitHub API, we'd like to send that information, that authentication token, along our request to make sure that the rating the low-level rating doesn't apply to us. So for that, I can create an interceptor. So that's a basic REST template interceptor. As you can see, we are looking at the token. If the Git token information is there, we'll create an auth value from it with a basic, and we'll base64 it, that value, and we'll send it in the authorization header. And that should be enough to GitHub. So we can create a new instance for this. And that's where the builder is quite handy, because we definitely don't want that information to leak to any other part or any other API that we might be using in our application. We just want this to be useful for our GitHub client. So that's where we can add an interceptor, which will be the new GitHub API app token interceptor. And we can use the properties get token here and compile. And, oh, I got a connection timeout. That must be the Wi-Fi behaving a bit. Otherwise, no. Ah, yeah, cool. Okay, so now we still have our application running, and we still have that, that endpoint working, but we still don't know if the token is sent properly, and that's a bit strange. And we don't even know if the value is set properly, where it comes from. We're missing a bit of context to know which is which. And that brings another question is, we don't know much about our application when it's running. If that application was running and we didn't have it running locally, we wouldn't know much about our application. And this is often something we want to have with most applications. We want to have non-functional requirements for our application, something that is not strictly related to our core business, but something that is really useful when you're running the application in production. So for this, you've probably seen that already. We've got an actuator. So actuator is a jar that Spring Boot provides with tons of features in it. And actuators provides a lot of things, and we'll see what. So when you restart your application, you see that you get additional endpoints configured with your application. So we can try to hit those. So here we've got 3 endpoints: itself, health, and info. So if you look at health, we know that the application is up, everything's fine, and info, we've got no specific information displayed here. So have you seen, if you already know about Spring Boot, you know that in 1.5, by default, we expose much more. And for Spring Boot 2.0, we did a few things, including setting the actuator under a different path. So it's not under the root path, it's under /actuator. So you can obviously change that with properties or even set it to root if you want. But it's pretty useful if you don't want to run into collision issues with your own application. If you've got already existing endpoints with the same name, it's really hard. So here, you've got less risk of collisions. And as well, you don't have security issues because it's pretty easy to add actuator and forget about setting the right security measures on your application, and finally expose a lot of things in your application over the internet that you didn't want exposed in the first place. So the new choice here is to secure by default everything. I have just those 2 exposed by default, and now it's up to you to make the right choice about security or exposing things. So here, because it's a demo, I'd like to show you more. So I'll show you the way to expose more. So if you use the management endpoint expose, here you can see that by default the value is health and info, and that's what we actually see. But if you want, you can list more or just say star. And I didn't have that. Yeah, cool, okay, it refreshes automatically. You know, with star, you have everything. So if you don't know about those, you have many super useful endpoints, including beans with the full list of all the beans, where they come from, which class, and all in your application. The conditions, this one is as well super useful if you'd like to know more about Spring Boot, why something behaves like this, and why that was configured or not configured as I expected. The conditions is super useful. It's more or less the equivalent of using the --debug flag when you start your application. So you get a full list of everything that Spring Boot auto-configured and not auto-configured for you. So you get a positive matches. So everything that we saw that you probably wanted us to auto-configure. So you get everything here, from here probably the Tomcat server to actuator features, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see if something is here that you didn't expect or something is missing, you can see why that configuration was applied and why it applied or not. So it can be a configuration property that was set to true, or it could be a class being there on your class path. It could be many things. So with this, you can see why and why not things were set up in the way they were. Configuration properties is pretty useful here as well. So here, if we look at GitHub, we can see that we've got our configuration properties taken into account with the prefix and the basic stuff. And we've got no values set for now. If you want to know more about that, you can directly look at the environment. And if you, let's say we want to know just more about the token that we have, here we can see that we've got nothing. But let's say if I say I'm using the right format here, so you'd see that that value, so because it's named token, so if it's named token or password or things like this, by default we don't expose the actual value, we replace it by stars. So you're sure that to not expose secrets without knowing it. And new in Spring Boot 2, we also pinpoint the exact source of a given application property. So here the line and the actual position in the file. So to know more about this, I'd like to do two things. I'd like to have an indicator, because let's say the GitHub API is not available. That will obviously break my application. So I'd like to embed in the health endpoint more information in the, not health, actuator health. So right now we only know it's up, but I'd like to know a bit more about this. So if you want to expose all the information, you can ask to show all the details about health. So you get a endpoint by endpoint configuration property for this. So if I recompile this, we can see that I get additional information about the health of my application. So whenever you add something to your application, so here I've only got a disk and a database, but let's say if you had another database, or if you add a Redis connection or something, we'll automatically add more health indicators to that list. So you can see that the global status is up, that I've got enough disk space, and that my database is running properly, and that I used a test query to that database, and that the database returns as up. So I'd like to have one like this, but for my GitHub API, because I'm using that as an external API, and it's pretty important to my application, so I'd like to know if things are working properly. So for this, we can provide more opinions to Spring Boot. So like many things I told you, whenever you want to add more to your application, you can add a starter. If you want to customize things, you can do things in your application properties. Or you can express more opinions and even leverage the existing infrastructure in Spring Boot, because in many places we provide customizers or ways to extend the existing infrastructure we provide for you. So we've seen that, for example, for the application properties. You can reuse the same stuff we're using internally. So here I'd like to have a GitHub health indicator. And that health indicator just has to implement the health indicator interface that we've got in Spring Boot, and have that as a component. So if we implement that method, we need basically our GitHub client and to send some requests and see if the result looks right. So for that, I can inject a GitHub client. that I already have, and I can use it. So I can try to fetch some events for Spring Boot. That'll be Spring projects. For the org, Spring projects, and Spring Boot. Get that as a response. And if I go, if that response, if the status is 200 something, then I'm happy and I return health up. Otherwise, I can return health down. You can add details and stuff, no problem. And in that case, if I can't even connect, I'll get an IO exception from that previous call. So I can catch that and say, if I have an exception because I can't connect or something, I can just return health down and this time provide an exception. I can add that exception, it'll be provided inside the response. So here, it'll make that call, and we can see that we get a new detail object in our array, and we've got a GitHub, so with the status up. And we could add more details like this, so we could add like the time it took to respond or things like this, if we feel it's useful. So now it's time to build the actual UI. So for this, I'll use ThymeLeaf and a few libraries. That will be the starter ThymeLeaf and a few WebJars. So if you don't know that, if you add WebJars to your application, so those are CSS and JavaScript libraries published to Maven Central under the WebJars project. So if you add those directly, Spring Boot will configure those and serve those directly as static resources in your application. So if I add that, then now I've got a web application with ThymeLeaf. And I can create a templates folder and add my dashboard template that I prepared previously. So dashboard. So the dashboard is a ThymeLeaf template, where you can see that I'm using the WebJars that I prepared, and that I have a template listing the projects and the events going on. So we can do that in our event controller and add that new endpoint. So with that endpoint, we need to map that on the root and call it dashboard. So several things. We want to get all the projects we've got in our database, fetch all the events from GitHub for each of those, and then we want to return that in the model before rendering the dashboard. So we know we want to render that dashboard entry template. We want to add things to the model, and then we can start things. So here we can use the repository and get all the projects. And now for each project, we'd like to send a request to GitHub and fetch things as a list. So because I want to get those as a list, I'll add a new method here, and you'll see why a bit later. So instead of getting the full response entity, I'd like to have a list of response here, fetch event list, and same thing, org name, repo name. And this time, I want to get the array, fetch events, and org name, repo name, get body. No? No, so I want to fetch the events here and get the body here directly. Okay, so I'll use that one in my controller. So I can, because this is an iterable, I want to use the stream support and stream the projects directly with its split iterator. So for each project, I want to map, I want to do that as well in parallel. So I want to map, and for each project, I want to return some object that is a dashboard entry. So dashboard entry, I don't have that yet. I've prepared that. So it's here. So a dashboard entry is basically one thing that contains the projects in the associated events. So for each project, we'll return instead a new dashboard entry with the project and the fetch event lists for the project, the org with its org, and the repo name. So we want to collect that to a list and have that as a local variable with all the entries right away. So we can add that to our model. We can add entries to our model, and that's it. So we can take a look at our basic dashboard, if it's available. Yeah. So we've got our dashboard with all the entries and all the queries that we did. So here for Spring Boot, we've got some entries for initializer and for Sagan. So we've got the basic stuff running for our application with time leaf and all the entries demonstrated. But let's say that I want to have something here like this. So we saw that we already have that as a default error page. So Spring Boot provides not only that default error handling in your application, but it also provides you a way to provide nice error pages in case you're building an application like this. So here, let's say that I've got that 404 that I'm not really happy with, and I can add a new template under an error folder, and I can say all the 4xx errors should be rendered as templates here. So I prepared a template, a real template, and instead of seeing that default error page, you can have anything you want. So as you can see, because it was a 404, this is dynamic. So this is a real template. So here in my template, I'm using variables that are provided by Spring Boot for every error page. So here, we've got the default error page for our application. But we're still missing something with our application because I've set that GitHub token, but we know that it's there, we know it's configured, we know it's being used because probably the application would have failed already. But at one point, at one specific point, we don't know where we are, if we have still a lot of queries or if we are almost very close to the limit. So with Actuator, we've got something called metrics, and we've got already quite a few metrics provided for you. So this is new in Spring Boot 2.0. Previously, we had metrics built into Spring Boot, and we tried to be compatible with several ways of collecting metrics and displaying them. But here, there's a new project in the Spring family, or related to the Spring family. It's called Micrometer. There's a talk about this tomorrow or the day after, I don't remember. If you're into metrics, I definitely encourage you to see that one, because previously the metrics were quite unidimensional. You had just one metric, and for any given metric, you could see only one way to see the data, and here it's much more powerful. So let's say we've got here something about our HTTP client requests, or let's say the server request. So we'd like to know more here about the server requests. You can see that I have five requests that we had four. We had gets. We had a 404. The 404 was not found. And let's say that events repo name, you see that those were counted against the specific route. And here we'd like to have a metric, but for our own stuff, for GitHub, our GitHub API. So for that, you can, just like a health indicator, you can leverage the existing infrastructure and reuse that to provide that information. So in our GitHub client, we know that we're getting that information back whenever we send a request. We get that information of the remaining calls as a header in our in the HTTP response. So to show you that, I can get that. So if we make a call and we don't have anything set up, let's say I want information about me and I just want to display the headers. Here we're getting the information about the response, and here you can see that we get the rate limit remaining 46. So because I don't have a specific token, I've got 60 per hour and I get only 46 left. So I'd like to get that information and display that as a metric so I can keep track of that in my application and to see if something is going wrong. So just like the previous one, we're building an interceptor. And that interceptor is doing two things. It's using something called the meter registry, which is new, which belongs to a micrometer. And we use that to create a new meter, which is a gauge. We'll call it GitHub rate limit remaining. And we'll create a new atomic integer for this. And this will be the value that keeps track of the remaining calls. So whenever we get a new request, we're in our interceptor, we execute that request, get the response back, return it, but before we return it, we use the value we get from the rate limit remaining header, and we'll set that metric directly. So here, by default, we get 0, but I could do 60, for example, for 60 per hour. So now that I've got that interceptor, which is not super hard to write, I can ask to be injected with the meter registry and add another interceptor to my client and registry and have my client working with this. So here, let's say I want to send a few requests to get that information. Spring Boot. Ooh, that's hard. Yay. So here, I'll get a new GitHub rate limit remaining metric. And if I look at that, it's 45 because I haven't set a specific token, but I've prepared a different configuration where I've set a token as an environment variable. So if I restart my application, good. If I send another request, and if I even go on my dashboard, which should send like 3 or more requests, actually. And if I look at this, here you can see much more. And if that one will get back or not, it should be less. Or Wi-Fi slow. OK, so you get that value as a metric. So it's much more comfortable because you know at any point you know where you are at that limit, and you can collect that and have that into a specific backend as a metric for your application. So one thing that we can take a look at as well for changes is the new security defaults and the new way we deal with security. So previously, if you had security, we had a lot of opinion, but it was quite hard to express your own and to add your own opinion into the mix. So here, let's say I want to have an admin page, and that admin page I've prepared this. So that admin page here, it's called admin. No, it doesn't exist because I didn't create that in my controller. So is it here? Yeah. So here in my controller, I can create a simple get mapping on /admin. And I want to have a default view. and I want to add a few things here, for example, my projects. So here, I know that I want to use the admin view, and I want to add the projects, all the projects to my model. So here, I've got my basic admin page where you can add and delete and do things about my own projects, but I definitely don't want this to be public. I'd like this to be secured and properly secured in my application. So for that, I can add a new starter, which is starter security, and restart my application. So whenever you do that, you express an opinion, which is, I'd like to secure things in my application. So if you do that by default, we not only configure a default user, which is called user with a default password that you can change. So that's the basic stuff working for you. But we also secure things by default, secure everything. So that's still the default in Spring Boot. But this time, we add more things to help you express your own opinion about security. And I'll do that quite quickly. So let's say I want to add a security configuration or a web security configuration. And so it's a configuration class that is using the web security adapter of Spring Security. And so this is basically hands-on. This is what you'd expect with raw Spring Security. But here we help you a lot to configure this. So here I want to add my user details. So here I create a user called user with this password, role user. Another one, admin with more roles, an actuator role, an admin, and a user role. So here you can override things and configure the HTTP security. So with HTTP, you can say that you want to authorize requests for example, the endpoint requests to any endpoint. So here, this is something new in Spring Boot 2.0. So instead of saying I'd like to make those actuator endpoints public and those protected, and you don't necessarily know the paths and depending on how things are secured. So here you can do things yourself. So let's say I want to secure, I want to know that I don't know, health or just info, for example. I just want to have info as public. And I want all the others to require the role actuator. Cool. And same thing, and I want to have the static, all the static resources, so all the common locations that are associated with the static resources in boot, including if you change the property. So I want that to be allowed to everyone. And you can do more things like and matchers and say that admin should be only allowed for the admin role, et cetera, et cetera. And let's say everything else is allowed. And I want HTTP basic for everything. So this time, if I go back here, I'll get a 404. Here I still get my dashboard, but if I go to /admin, I'll get a HTTP basic authentication. And here that was admin. So if I go admin, I know that I'll get access to the right page. So I've got the security configuration running with my opinion and everything that was required for this. So one last thing that I wanted to show you as well is new as well is in HTTP 2. In Spring Boot 2, it's HTTP 2 support. So let's say until now, what you could do with your Spring Boot application is configure SSL. So that's what we'll do. I've got a key store ready So this is where you store your certificate and TLS certificate. So if you add that to your resources in your application, you've got a key store available here in your application. You can configure TLS in your application quite easily. So let's say first I want to have that on port 84, yeah, here. What's going on? Okay. And then I'd like to have more things. So let's say the key store is located in my class path, and it's called key store like this. What does it think? It's on multi-line. Okay. And then server dot the key password. So I've set a key store password and a key password. The key store password is password, and the key password is secret. So if I do that, I can go to localhost here, and I've got my application using HTTPS. So quite simple. One thing that I did that you probably didn't see is that I locally installed a native library, which is Tomcat Native. So Tomcat Native is quite useful if you want to add native support for OpenSSL and have a super efficient SSL infrastructure for serving TLS requests. So I've got that, and if you have that, you have HTTP support possible with JDK 8 and plus and Tomcat 8.5 and plus. So if I just have that and configure it as a library for my application, then I can go server HTTP2 enabled. Let me show you something first, so you don't believe me here. So here it's HTTP 1.1, and if I just mark it as enabled, my application should restart, and it should refresh the whole thing. And here I'm using HTTP2 right away. So you should know that you can use that with Tomcat 8.5 with native support, or Tomcat 9 and JDK 9, because JDK 9 and Tomcat 9 support have the right TLS support for HTTP2. Or you can just use Undertow for any versions of JDK 8, 9, and whatnot, no native required. And with the next version of Spring Boot, we should also add Jetty support with HTTP2 with also a native library. So you know that you don't need to do strange things with the JVM or with an agent or something else. You can have that out of the box and quite easily set up with your application. So I had a few more things, but that's quite all of this. Yeah, that'll be all. So I hope you liked everything here. Here's the code again. So you can take a look at the repository, everything. You'll have all the steps described with each commit, and you'll see all the changes. So you can take a look, and that'll be it. Don't hesitate to reach out to me on Twitter or right now. And if you're interested in a bit more of this, there was the What's New in Spring Boot 2.0 this morning, but it's recorded. And I encourage you to take a look at Micrometer as well if you're interested in metrics. And there'll be another presentation about Spring Boot 2.0 with Stefan and I tomorrow. If you've got questions. Okay. Thank you.